When I first moved into this house, I was drawn to its silence and seclusion. But over time, that silence began to weigh on me. I started noticing strange sounds at night, as if someone else was here with me. I tried to dismiss it as the creaking of old walls. But one night, I woke up to a distinct noise coming from the attic and realized something was not right. I had moved to this house not long ago, leaving behind the stifling rhythm of the city and the endless gray buildings surrounding my apartment. This house sat on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by fields and forest, promising peace and solitude, just what I'd been longing for. It was an old house, once owned by an elderly couple who had lived here all their lives, until the last of them passed away just a few months prior. In the evenings, the house was enveloped in silence, allowing me to hear every subtle movement: the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind outside, the rustling of leaves. At first, the silence was almost soothing, but day by day, I felt the house starting to change. Being here, I began to feel uneasy. I hadn't gone up to the attic; it wasn't necessary. The old belongings, boxes left by the previous owners, didn't interest me. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, as if the place itself had forgotten it was ever touched. But one night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint, barely noticeable, like someone slowly dragging something heavy across the attic floor. I thought maybe it was the wind, or perhaps rats. But even the idea of rats wasn't exactly comforting. The sudden noise in the stillness disturbed me, but I tried to ignore it and fall back asleep. However, the next night the sound returned. This time it was clearer, a dull scraping, as if something was clawing against the wood. I lay in bed listening, feeling increasingly uneasy with each passing minute. Gradually, my fear gave way to irritation. After all, it was just an old, creaky house full of forgotten things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this sound was deliberate. By the third night, I'd had enough. I could hear something tapping in the attic. There was something deliberate, rhythmic in it, as if someone was intentionally moving things around. My heart was racing, and I decided it was time to put an end to this. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed to the stairs leading up to the attic. The staircase, like the rest of the house, was old and creaked under my steps. With each creak, it felt as though the house was responding to my presence. As I reached the attic, I froze, sweeping my flashlight across the dark space. The shadows cast by the light looked strange, distorted, and thick darkness hung from the ceiling. My flashlight beam glided over old boxes, chairs, and shelves lined with books. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, from the right, I caught a faint movement. I whipped the light in that direction, but saw nothing. Just boxes, an old trunk, and a couple of mirrors wrapped in cloth. I exhaled, trying to calm myself, and started looking around, considering leaving. But at that moment, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible rustling, as if someone had moved cautiously beside me. My eyes started to the old trunk. For a moment, it seemed slightly open, though I didn't remember touching it. I stepped closer to inspect it, but my flashlight flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. I turned the flashlight back on, finding myself just a few steps from the trunk. My heart was pounding, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I looked again, it seemed as if the trunk's lid was open just a bit more. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the lid and lifted it quickly, expecting to find something that would explain the sounds. But there was nothing. Only an old folded cloth covered in dust. However, as soon as I let go of the lid, it slammed shut, making me jump back. I retreated, not trusting my own eyes, feeling fear creeping up inside me. Maybe it was just the old attic settling, or some kind of mechanism. I tried to find a logical explanation, but my mind resisted. When I went back downstairs, I felt a little better, but the fear from what had just happened didn't leave me. That night, I barely slept, listening to the quiet house. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps in the attic light, as if someone was trying to stay quiet. The next day, I went about my day as usual, but the thought of the attic haunted me. I could no longer sit comfortably in the house, feeling a chill run down my spine. It felt as though something intangible had shifted, and now this place felt like a threat. On the fourth night, when I was on the edge of a nervous breakdown, the noise returned. This time it was footsteps. No, not just footsteps, but a thundering sound, as though someone was moving heavy furniture. I lay in the darkness, unable to move, feeling fear take over every nerve. I knew I should go check, but my body refused to obey. When the noise finally stopped, I gathered my courage. I went upstairs, as if something was leading me, and when I entered the attic, it felt as though this whole terror was simply a product of my imagination. But in the corner of the attic on an old dresser, something was moving. One of the drawers slowly slid open on its own, as if an unseen hand was holding the handle. I froze, unable to believe my eyes. The drawer opened fully, and at its bottom lay an old photograph. I stepped closer, unable to resist. The picture showed a man sitting on the porch of this house, staring straight at the camera, but something in his eyes reflected the very fear I was feeling. My mind resisted, but I couldn't look away from the photo. It was a moment of realization, as though all my fears were captured in that stranger's gaze. At that moment, I understood. The house remembered everyone who had been here, every glance, every movement. And now it was remembering me. I went downstairs, realizing I couldn't stay here any longer. This house was no longer mine, and the longer I stayed, the more it affected me, making me see, feel, and fear. I dashed for the door, feeling something reaching out from the darkness. I ran from the house, leaving everything behind. I've never returned to that house, but sometimes in the dead of night I still hear that creak, those footsteps, and the thundering noises from the attic. I remember the first time I saw it. The shadow was faint, barely noticeable, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a play of light. But with each passing day it became more real, more sinister. Soon I could no longer ignore that it was not merely a reflection of me. It was something alien, something that followed me. When I moved into the new apartment, all I sought was peace and solitude. The buildings around me, the closed windows and the muffled voices of neighbors seemed exactly what I needed after years of living in noisy dorms and cramped apartments where someone was always close by. Here, at last, I could shut the door and immerse myself in calm without hearing anyone's footsteps or random noises from behind the wall. In the first days, I relished the solitude, savoring it in small doses. The evenings, when I turned off the lights and went to sleep, passed peacefully. But then I began to notice something strange. It was on the third or fourth evening when I returned home, tired, turned off the lights, and sat on the bed. When I accidentally glanced at the wall across from me, there on the pale surface, a shadow stood out sharply. At first, I thought it was my own shadow, a thin silhouette mimicking the shape of my body. But as I stared at it, I felt something was wrong. This shadow was wrong. My body stood still, but the shadow on the wall swayed slightly, as though it was cramped within its own shape. I watched it for several seconds, and subtle, almost imperceptible movements began to appear, as if the shadow was moving on its own. I blamed it on fatigue and ignored it. The next day, when I came home as usual, I turned off the lights and saw it again. This time, its outline was thicker and more defined, as though it became more real with each glance. A cold unease spread within me, but I pushed it away, convincing myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But with each following evening, the shadow continued to appear, growing more and more unfamiliar. Sometimes it stretched, at other times it became wider, more massive. I tried not to look at it. I turned off the light and immediately turned to the wall, trying not to notice how the shadow searched for me with its gaze. But the more I avoided it, the more it seemed to draw my attention. One evening, when I allowed myself to look at it, I thought the shadow was moving toward me, and I instinctively recoiled. This movement seemed to give it energy. My own shadow no longer obeyed me. Weeks passed. I left the light on more often, even sleeping with the desk lamp on. But this only made the apartment resemble a prison cell, bathed in a lifeless light that accentuated its emptiness. I knew the shadow was still here in the corner of my mind. One evening I decided to turn off the lights, intending to face it if, of course, it had a face. But in response, I was met only with a silent, muted presence that filled the room. Once again, its silhouette appeared on the wall when I entered the room. There was something familiar and terrifying about it, as though I were looking at an old friend I hadn't seen in years. But each time I looked closely, it changed, distorting into something alien. I tried to ignore it, but the shadow seemed to chase me, growing more intrusive, defying all reason. And then, one night, while lying in the dark, I saw it again. This time it was in a different place, opposite the bed, as if waiting for the moment to come closer. In a panic, I turned on the light and rushed to the wall. Of course, there was nothing there, but the fear continued to build, turning into paranoia. I found myself beginning to fear my own apartment, afraid to remain in silence, in solitude. I tried talking about it to my friends, but they just laughed, calling it a silly fear, and worse, they suggested I befriend the shadow. But this wasn't just fear, it was the sensation that someone was watching, even when I was alone. I tried not to think about it, but the fear pulled me in, and it began to seem like the shadow never left. It seemed to have a life of its own. After some time, I even decided to record what was happening to analyze it later. The camera captured the usual room, no shadow, but this didn't bring relief. I knew it existed, knew it was watching. Now, every evening, when I turned off the lights, I saw it again. It didn't disappear. It seemed to embed itself deeper into the walls. One night, when I, exhausted from insomnia, accidentally fell asleep, I was awoken by a barely audible whisper, as if someone was speaking to me from the depths of the room. I tensed, my heart racing, but I didn't move. A loud bang on the wall broke my stupor, and I turned on the light, leaping out of bed. My hand trembled as I directed the flashlight into the corner of the room. The shadow was there, and it seemed closer now, almost tangible, though it had no face. I realized something had happened. It had finally detached from me, and I no longer controlled it. On the wall opposite the bed, where simple dark outlines once hung, I saw the familiar silhouette, but it was larger than me. Now it seemed the shadow had its own life. I tried to live with it again, but this was more than just fear, more than paranoia. I noticed that every evening it came closer, as if it intended to say something. Its presence became more and more palpable, thick, like the air before a storm. I seemed to hear footsteps nearby, as though someone was walking behind me. It began to invade my dreams. I saw it even with my eyes closed, and one night when I, drained of all strength, finally turned off the light, the shadow appeared beside me. This time, it wasn't on the wall, but right next to me, stretching toward my body, covering all the light coming from the window. I felt the silent stillness consuming me, poisoning each breath, leaving me alone with my fear. Have you ever wondered how your own home can become strange and frightening? It's supposed to be a normal place, somewhere you should feel safe. I've never been a superstitious person, but after moving into this apartment, something changed. I moved here a couple of weeks ago, drawn in by the low price and the view of the old park across the road. It's a small place, just one room and a tiny kitchen, but it's more than enough for me. Work takes up almost all of my time, and the apartment serves as a refuge, a quiet place to unwind and escape for a bit. From the very first evening, I noticed something odd. As soon as the sun went down and the room grew darker, the window started to draw my gaze. It's just a simple old window with chipped paint on the frame, yet it instantly made me feel uneasy. At first, I thought it was just an empty window facing a dark street. What could possibly be scary about that? But one evening, glancing at it casually, I noticed something strange. In the reflection of the window, I caught a glimpse of a face. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just an optical illusion. But after a second, I looked again, and a chill ran through me. There really was a face in the reflection, a face I didn't recognize. Slightly off-center, as if someone were standing behind me in the shadows, but not moving. I turned quickly, almost banging into the wall, but of course there was no one there. Just the quiet, still room. I'd never been the type to believe in superstitions, and I certainly hadn't feared the dark. But that night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept forcing myself to turn toward the wall, squeezing my eyes shut, but each time that strange feeling came back. The next morning, I chalked it up to fatigue, and by the evening I'd mostly forgotten about it. But that evening, it happened again. Almost mechanically, I glanced at the window, and there it was again, the face. The stranger's reflection remained still, yet this time he seemed closer, as if he'd moved one step nearer to me. I froze, unable to look away. Seconds passed slowly. The silence filled the room, and finally I forced myself to turn around. Again an empty room, silence. I felt foolish. a mix of anger and irritation blending with a vague anxiety. What were these silly fears? Why was I so frightened of something as trivial as a trick of light in the window? With each evening, things got worse. I began to notice the face as soon as the room grew dark. At first, it just stood behind me, but over time, I felt as if it was moving closer every night. I tried not to look, to avoid glancing at my own reflection, but it was impossible. The more I tried to avoid looking, the stronger the urge became to check again. By the fourth or fifth evening, I lost my peace entirely. Frustration, anger, and fear overwhelmed me, and before I knew it, I stormed over to the window and shut the curtains with such force that I nearly tore them down. I felt a brief sense of relief, but the dread remained. It only lurked, waiting for the moment I'd be alone again. A few hours later, I glanced up at the window again. My nerves were taut, trembling with tension. Would I see him through the curtains this time? Of course, I knew it was absurd, but the thought that his reflection might appear even through the fabric gripped my mind. That night, I woke up, gripped by fear. Everything was quiet, no footsteps, no rustling, but I knew I wouldn't sleep until I checked the window. This wild, almost primal fear compelled me to look, to confirm maybe he was still there. The next day, I left the house as if fleeing. I worked overtime just to avoid returning to the apartment. Colleagues noticed I looked exhausted. Nervous, but I didn't share my thoughts. Who could I tell that I feared seeing a stranger in my own reflection? No one would understand. That night I came home late and exhausted, thinking I'd collapse straight into bed. But as soon as I opened the door, I felt his presence. It was everywhere, as if the whole space had absorbed this invisible threat. With a heavy sigh, I didn't even take off my jacket. I headed straight to the bathroom, avoiding looking in the direction of the window. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the air felt thick and heavy, like something was clinging to it. The bathroom was even worse. I felt something cold breathing down my neck. Frozen in place, I stared into the mirror, too afraid to turn around. My heart pounded so loudly it seemed to echo through the whole apartment. After that night, something inside me broke. I stopped trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion or imagination. Each evening, as soon as the sun set, I began to panic. I felt that whoever it was, this figure, this stranger, was getting closer. He no longer just watched me. He wanted something more. After a week, I could no longer eat or sleep. I barely stayed in the apartment for more than a few minutes. The anxiety weighed on me, draining me. I stopped noticing people around me, stopped responding to colleagues' questions and jokes. Each day was like a race, an attempt to escape from that face that haunted me, no matter how hard I tried. One evening, coming home late, I went into the apartment and looked at the window again. I wanted to make sure he was there, wanted to see him, whether I wanted to or not. I approached the window and stood there, waiting. This time, I didn't even try to hide my fear. His face was there, in the reflection, but now it was almost touching mine. Pale skin, a motionless gaze, eyes full of cold detachment. I looked at him, but I didn't recognize him, and at that moment, I understood. He wasn't a stranger. In the reflection was my own face, but twisted beyond recognition with fear and despair. This person who had been haunting me all these days was nothing but my own reflection. But I could no longer deny his presence. Broken, I finally realized. The more I avoided his gaze, the closer he would come.